A friend was visiting Kenya and bought a brand new camera for this trip. He isn't a wildlife photographer and asked me for 2 or 3 simple settings before going on safari. I get this a fair bit from my friends. While I do help as much as I can, unfortunately there are no 2 or 3 simple settings. More features a camera comes with, the more the setting one needs to meddle with. And the auto mode in cameras is far from working automatically. So in this video, I show you how I set my camera up for a safari so you can set it and forget it when you're out there. In the end, I'll also show you how I have a reset button that reverts back to the settings I started with if I've mucked around the setting too much during the safari and can't find my way back. Fair warning, I am not a camera geek. I haven't opened the manuals of some of the cameras I've bought, let alone read them. So there's probably a more technically sound way of doing some of this. But I'm lazy, so I've leaned towards ways that are simple and require the least amount of effort without compromising on the image. While I'm showing the settings on the Canon R7, they'll be similar across most Canon mirrorless cameras, and the concepts are the same across all camera brands, while the exact settings might be in different places. So if you're able to understand these settings, you should be able to set them up on your own cameras irrespective of the brand. So when on safaris, I'm optimizing for one of two things. One, a nice portrait of an animal or a bird, or some slow, minimal movement such as a tiger walking along a road. And two, some action such as a bird flying, an antelope leaping across the road, and so on. For a nice portrait or minimal movement, I need the aperture to be at the widest, because not only are we allowing for most light, but we're also on the shallowest depth of field. So I choose the Aperture Priority or AV. Once I put my camera on Aperture Priority and set it to the maximum aperture, which is 7.1 on this lens, I then choose the minimum shutter speed that the camera needs to shoot on and program that in, such as 1/400th or 1/500th of a second. Interestingly, this can be done using the ISO speed settings on Canon. A good rule of thumb is that if you're shooting at 500 mm, then 1/500th of a second is the slowest you can safely handhold and shoot at. If your lens has the highest focal length of 400, then 1/400th of a second should be your minimum shutter speed. I think this rule is also an artifact from the DSLR era when image stabilization wasn't as advanced as it is today. So sometimes I set it at 1/250th of a second on the 500 mm lens and I still get sharp usable shots. I then set ISO on auto up to a maximum of 25K, which is very manageable in terms of noise on mirrorless cameras. So when there isn't enough light, the camera can bump up ISO all the way up to 25K instead of lowering shutter speed. This covers most situations, but sometimes it gets cloudy or very dark, such as the beginning of a safari or at the very end when light isn't enough and the camera produces a dark underexposed image. That is the compromise I am willing to make because it's possible to recover some detail in a dark image in Lightroom, but there's no tool that can recover lost sharpness. I've learned this the hard way from this tiger image, which was from my first ever tiger sighting. The other situation I need to optimize for is when I expect action, a bird flying, an antelope leaping across the road, and so on. For these, the one setting that I need is to have fast shutter speed, such as 1/2000th of a second. I could do this on shutter priority, but if I can also get the widest aperture while having this, why not? So I also do this on the aperture priority mode, much like the previous setting. However, there's one small change. I set the minimum shutter to be at 1/2000th of a second. ISO is still a max of 25K. This setting helps me optimize for action. Now, these are the only two modes I'm on with respect to the values of the exposure triangle, aperture, ISO, and shutter. However, there are a few more settings that are really important that we need to get right in the field to ensure that we're getting good images. These involve autofocusing, white balance, metering, and so on. Before we get into these settings, also ensure that the lens is on autofocusing and on the still images as opposed to the videos mode, because these settings are for still images only. Now the other settings are JPEG versus RAW. I always shoot on RAW or Canon RAW. A RAW file holds a lot more information and is easier to correct in Lightroom or Photoshop. But if you don't want to spend time editing, you can shoot in JPEG. I set the autofocusing mode on AF servo because in wildlife, it's hard to find perfectly still subjects. I set subject to detect as animals. On my Canon R5 and R7, it works beautifully, but it struggled a bit to identify orangutans in Borneo and cheetahs in Kenya. So I have a hack for that, which I'll explain in the end. I enable the equivalent of continuous tracking on my camera as well. White balance, if you're shooting in RAW, that is easily corrected in post. If not, then a neutral setting such as daylight is probably the best for wildlife. Metering, I'm always on center weighted evaluative, and I shoot in burst mode, also known as the spray and pray mode in some wildlife circles. I'll share this in detail in the video description as well as towards the end of the video. Now, here's the catch. When the tiger shows up in the field, oftentimes it's just a fleeting glimpse that we get between two cars or trees. We can't then be juggling through half a dozen settings. We need a magic button that resets the camera back to our desired set of controls. Thankfully, we can do this using custom modes. So if I've changed my settings during the course of a drive to photograph a landscape or a silhouette, as soon as something comes up, I go back to one of the three custom modes, which are here, C1, C2 or C3, because these are pre-programmed modes that hold a bunch of settings across modes, including focusing, white balance, metering, and so on. So when I go to C1, I know I'm in aperture priority, I'll be shooting at no less than 1/500th of a second, the animal eye autofocus is on, and so on and so forth. Though it varies across camera makes and models, it's fairly simple to set up a custom mode. Once you've set up for aperture priority for shooting a portrait, set focusing, eye autofocus, white balance, and everything else that is required that I mentioned earlier, and then find the equivalent of custom shooting mode. In Canon cameras, it's in the yellow menu or the spanner icon menu on the last tab. Go into the custom shooting menu and choose the mode, say C1, that you want this setting to be registered on, and then every time you move to C1, these pre-programmed settings get activated. C1 is my portrait or minimal motion setting on aperture priority with a minimum shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. C2 is my action settings, also on aperture priority with the minimum shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. Now C3 is my safety mode. In case animal eye autofocus doesn't work, for example like the orangutan I mentioned, or the animal is in really thick foliage and there's no clear eye that the camera can find. So for that, I disable continuous tracking and eye detection and set the AF to single point or 1-point AF so that I can put the subject right in the middle of the frame and help the camera focus on it correctly. I've shared these settings along with icons so you can figure it out in your cameras, and these are broadly the only three settings I need depending on what shows up. There's an old saying in photography which goes F8 and be there, meaning that being there is more important than, say, fussing over the settings. It couldn't be true of a wildlife. But in order to really be there in wildlife, along with the F number, we need like a dozen more settings in place. Having programmed them in custom mode helps me really be there and enjoy the moment without worrying about the settings. In case there are other settings that I hadn't thought about or mentioned here, do let me know. If there's a better way or preferably an easier way to do some of this, let me know about that as well. Thank you for watching.